She stood at the edge of her own wedding celebration, a stranger among the glittering guests. Her husband, the Duke of Thornwood, had not looked at her once since the vows were spoken. He stood near the towering windows, deep in conversation with an elderly lord, his profile sharp and unreadable. The grand ballroom of Thornwood Hall shimmered with candlelight and the rustle of silk, but Alara felt a cold so deep it seemed to settle in her bones. She whispered to no one, her voice barely a breath. "He doesn't remember me." Her fingers brushed the hidden locket beneath her bodice. Inside, pressed flat and fragile, was a tiny forget-me-not, dried for 12 long years. The boy who gave it to her had promised her the world on a sunlit summer afternoon. He had held her hand beside a lake and sworn, with all the solemn sweetness of a 12-year-old, that he would marry her when they grew up. Then he had disappeared from her life like mist. And now that boy was a man, a cold, distant duke who had married her not for love, but to settle an old debt between families. His steward had arrived at her family's modest manor 6 weeks ago with a contract, not a courtship. Her father, broken by scandal and fatting health, had wept with relief. Alara had said yes because the boy she never forgot was asking, even if he did not know it. But standing in that ballroom, her wedding ring heavy on her finger, she understood the truth. Cassian Thornwood had no memory of the lake, no memory of the promise. To him, she was merely a duty wrapped in ivory silk. The first night was worse. He led her to a suite of rooms that connected to his by a single heavy door, and that door remained firmly closed. He had spoken only a handful of words to her since the ceremony. "Your chambers have been prepared. I trust you will find them comfortable." No warmth, no gentle hand, just a slight bow and the click of the door between them. Alara stood in the center of her beautiful, lonely room, and the tears came silently. She had dreamed of this reunion for years, imagining the moment he would recognize her, the way his eyes would soften. She had saved every scrap of memory, the little boat they had made from a fallen branch, the wild strawberries he had picked for her, the way he had called her Ella because he struggled with her full name. But none of it mattered now. The first month passed in heavy velvet silence. Alara rose early, dressed carefully, and walked the halls of Thornwood Hall like a shadow. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, was kind but formal. The staff watched her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She learned the rhythms of the estate, the endless passageways, the gallery of stern Thornwood ancestors who stared down at her with painted disapproval. Cassian was rarely present. When he was, he treated her with perfect, crushing courtesy. He inquired after her comfort. He ensured she had a horse to ride, access to the library, a generous allowance. He did everything a dutiful husband should do except love her. But Alara still held a fragile thread of hope. She believed that somewhere beneath his ice, the boy she remembered still existed. She tried to reach him in small ways. At dinner one evening, she said, "The lake here reminds me of another lake I once knew. It had willows along the bank, and the water was so clear you could see the stones at the bottom." Cassian glanced at her briefly. "Many lakes resemble one another." "I once met someone there," she pressed gently. "A boy who—" "I rarely visited lakes as a child," he said, and his tone closed the subject like a door. She stopped bringing it up. Instead, she poured her hope into daily routines. She visited the tenants, many of whom had never been visited by the lady of the manor in years. She brought baskets of food to a family with a sick child, sat with an elderly woman who had no one, and learned the names of every farmer on the estate's north ridge. The tenants began to speak of her warmly. "The new Duchess has a heart," they said. Cassian heard this from his steward. He felt a flicker of something he could not name, surprise, perhaps, or an uncomfortable gratitude, but he did not act on it. Then came the afternoon of Lady Maries. Lady Maries Ashfield was the beautiful widow of a viscount, a woman with eyes like winter and a laugh that cut like glass. She had made no secret of her designs on the Duke of Thornwood before his sudden marriage, and she did not trouble to hide her contempt for his new bride. At a small afternoon tea hosted by a neighboring countess, Maurice cornered Alara near the rose garden. "How fortunate you are," Maurice said, her voice dripping sweetness, "to rise so quickly from a family nearly disgraced to the position of duchess. Some girls have all the luck." Alara held her teacup steady. "I am grateful for my husband's kindness." "Kindness?" Maurice smiled. "Yes, Cassian is ever dutiful, but duty is not the same as affection, is it? I wonder if you have learned the difference yet." The women nearby fell silent. Alara felt heat climb her throat, but she refused to look away. "I imagine the difference is something we all learn with time, Lady Maurice." The widow laughed lightly, but her eyes were sharp. "Time can be very cruel, my dear. Do enjoy your season in the sun. Winters at Thornwood are so very cold." Alara returned to the estate that evening with a smile fixed on her face, but her heart was bruised. Cassian found her in the library, seated by the fire without a book in her hands. He paused in the doorway, struck by her stillness. "You returned early," he said. "I did." She did not elaborate. She did not run to him with complaints or tears. She simply looked at him with those quiet gray eyes and then turned back toward the flames. Something about that unsettled him more than any weeping would have done. The turning point arrived not with a thunderclap but with a single, quiet morning. Alara woke, looked out at the gray sky, and realized she was exhausted, not in body but in spirit. She had been chasing a ghost, a boy who no longer existed. The man who had taken his place was not unkind, but he was also not hers, and she was destroying herself piece by hopping otherwise. That morning she placed the locket with the forget-me-not in a small rosewood box and closed the lid. She did not throw it away. She simply stopped wearing it next to her heart. She began to eat her meals at different hours, filling her days with work among the tenants and the local village. She stopped appearing at the dinner table, sending a polite note instead. At first, Cassian barely noticed. He was buried in state affairs and political correspondence. But after a week of empty chairs and silent hallways, the absence began to grate on him. He came upon her unexpectedly one afternoon in the East Garden. She was kneeling in the soil, planting lavender with the gardener's young daughter. Her hands covered in earth, her hair escaping its pins. She was laughing, a sound he had never truly heard from her. And she looked so free, so entirely unlike the stiff, hopeful bride who had once waited at his dinner table. He stopped walking, something twisted behind his ribs. "Duchess," he called. She looked up and the laughter faded into polite composure. "Your Grace. You have been occupied lately." "There is much to do. The tenant cottages needed repairs, and I have been assisting Mrs. Pemberton with the inventory for the winter stores." She wiped her hands on her apron, entirely unself-conscious. "Was there something you required?" The question landed strangely. Required, as if her only purpose was to serve his needs. He realized with a sting of shame that he had never given her reason to believe otherwise. "No," he said awkwardly, "nothing." She nodded and returned to the lavender, her attention already drifting away from him. Cassian stood there for a long moment, feeling thoroughly dismissed. The sensation was new and not at all pleasant. A fortnight later, Lord Nathaniel Ashby arrived. Nathaniel Ashby was a baron from a neighboring county, a young man with a warm smile and eyes the color of summer grass. He had known Alara when they were children, not as intimately as Cassian had, but enough to share memories of riverside picnics and stolen apple tarts. He came to Thornwood Hall under the guise of business with the Duke, but it was clear from the first dinner that his true purpose was Alara. He greeted her with unguarded delight. "Ella, I heard you had become a duchess, but I could scarcely believe it. You look exactly the same, except more dignified, perhaps." Alara's whole face brightened. "Nathaniel, it has been so many years." Cassian watched from the head of the table as his wife laughed easily with another man, a man who called her by a childhood nickname that Cassian himself had never been given. The Duke's jaw tightened. He did not recognize the hot, churning sensation in his chest as jealousy. He told himself it was irritation at a guest's overfamiliarity. But over the following days, Nathaniel was everywhere. He accompanied Alara on her morning walks to the village. He sat beside her at tea, recounting old stories that made her smile with genuine happiness. Cashin found himself lingering near doorways, watching interactions that felt like a slowly closing gate, one that shut him out completely. One evening, a week into Nathaniel's visit, Cashin overheard something that shattered his composure. He was passing the conservatory when he heard Nathaniel's voice, low and earnest. "Ella, you cannot tell me you are happy here. The man is a marble statue. He does not see you. He does not value you. I have never stopped regretting that I did not speak sooner. Come away with me. I would give you everything he has not." Cashin went cold. He waited for Alara's reply, his heart hammering against his ribs. Her voice came softly but clearly. "Nathaniel, you are a dear friend and I thank you for your concern, but I will not dishonor my vows. I made a promise, even if that promise means nothing to him. I will not leave." It should have relieved him. Instead, her words carved him open. Even if that promise means nothing to him. He realized then how thoroughly she had given up on him. She did not stay out of hope or love. She stayed out of duty, just as he had married her out of duty. He turned and walked away, his chest a hollowed-out place. Nathaniel left 2 days later. The farewell between him and Alara was tender but restrained. Cashin watched from the steps of the manor, his hands clenched at his sides. When the carriage finally disappeared down the drive, Alara turned to go inside, and he caught her arm. "Might I have a word?" His voice was rougher than he intended. She looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. "Of course." They went to his study. The fire crackled, but the room felt icy. Cashin paced to the window and back, struggling for words. "Ashby made you an offer." She did not flinch. "You overheard." "I did," he faced her, "and you refused him." "Did you expect me to disgrace you?" "I expected," he stopped. What had he expected? He did not know. "Why did you stay, truly?" Alara stood very still. "Because I once believed something beautiful could grow here, and even when I stopped believing, I could not bear to become the kind of woman who breaks her word." "What did you believe?" he asked, the question almost a demand. She met his eyes. "That the boy who gave me a forget-me-not beside a lake would remember. That he would wake up and see me, not as a contract, but as the girl he promised to marry when we were children." The silence that followed was vast and terrible. Cashin shook his head, truly bewildered. I have no memory of that. You must be mistaken." Something in her face closed. "I know. I realized that a long time ago. Now, if you will excuse me, I have letters to write." She left him standing alone in the firelight. He felt as though the floor had shifted beneath him. He wanted to dismiss her words as a fantasy, but they would not leave him. That night he lay awake, sifting through shadows of his boyhood. There had been a summer at his aunt's estate, Lake Sarin. He had been 12, grieving his mother's recent death, withdrawn and angry. And then a little girl with gray eyes and tangled curls had appeared, trailing after him like a persistent sunbeam. He had called her Ella because it was easier. They had played by the lake, built a little boat. She had cried when he left. He had forgotten. He had forgotten completely. The weight of that realization pressed down on him so heavily he could scarcely breathe. He had married the girl who had once been the brightest point in a dark year, and he had treated her like a stranger. Worse, like a burden. The following days were agony. Cashin tried to reach for her, but he did not know how. He found himself hovering near the morning room where she worked on ledgers, inventing trivial questions just to see her face. She answered him politely, but her warmth was gone. She had stopped hopping, and the absence of her hope was a cold, silent wound. He deserved it. That was the worst part. He deserved every cool glance and clipped answer. He had been blind and proud, wrapped in his own quiet grief and stubborn solitude, and he had crushed her gentle heart without ever realizing it. Then, when the first autumn storm swept the valley, Elara fell ill. She had been out for 3 days straight, helping families whose cottages had flooded in the rising river. She had waded through freezing water, wrapped shivering children in blankets, and refused to rest until the last family was safe in the village hall. By the time she returned to the manor, her lips were blue and her body was shaking uncontrollably. Mrs. Pemberton put her to bed and sent for the physician. By nightfall, her fever was raging. Cassian was in his study when the housekeeper found him, her face pale with worry. "Your Grace, the Duchess, the physician fears it may be lung fever. She is asking for someone called Cass. We do not know who that is." Cassian's blood turned to ice. He was on his feet and running before he knew what he was doing. He found her in her bedchamber, the fire blazing but her body shivering violently beneath the coverlets. Her cheeks were flushed with unnatural color, and her breath came in shallow, rattling gasps. He sank into the chair beside her bed and took her burning hand. "Elara, I am here." Her eyes opened, glassy and unfocused. "Cass," she whispered, "I knew you would come back. You promised you would come back." He pressed her fingers to his lips, his throat so tight he could hardly speak. "I am here, little Ella, I am here." She smiled, a fragile, heartbreaking smile, and closed her eyes again. The physician shook his head, speaking of dangerous nights ahead and the need for constant vigilance. Cassian did not move from the chair. He stayed through the long, dark hours, listening to her rambling, feverish words. She spoke of the lake, the boat with the yellow leaf sail, the strawberries that stained her fingers. She spoke of waiting at the gate for him the next summer, and the summer after that, until she finally understood he was not coming back. She spoke of her wedding day, how she had worn the locket beneath her gown, hoping he would see it and remember. Cassian wept. The tears fell silently down his face, dropping onto the back of her hand. He had been her heartbreak. He had been the wound she carried for 12 years, and she had come to him anyway, hopping only for recognition. In the darkest hour of the night, he remembered where he had put the memory. His aunt had sent a letter years ago with a small painting enclosed, a miniature of a little girl with gray eyes. "Your summer friend," the note had said. "She still asks after you." He had been a youth of 17 then, drowning in the weight of his new title, and he had shoved the letter into a drawer and forgotten it entirely. When dawn broke, he left her side only long enough to tear through his old study. He found the letter in a forgotten box at the back of a cabinet. The paper was yellowed and brittle. The painting showed a child with a stubborn chin and a hopeful smile. And on the back, in his aunt's looping script, was written, "Elara Vance, aged 8. She says she is keeping a promise." He carried the miniature back to her sick room and placed it on the bedside table. Then he returned to his vigil, holding her hand and speaking to her in a low, steady voice. "I remember, Ella. The boat sank and you cried because you thought the fish would be homeless. I gave you a forget-me-not and told you it would help you remember me. I promised I would marry you when I was grown. I forgot. I forgot everything. But I remember now. Please, please don't leave me. I only just remembered." 3 days passed before the fever broke. Cassian did not eat, did not sleep. He bathed her forehead with cool water and talked to her through the long nights, pouring out every buried feeling he had never been able to name. He told her about his mother's death, his father's coldness, the crushing loneliness of inheriting a dukedom at 17. He told her that he had locked his heart away so tightly he had forgotten how to find it. And he told her that somewhere, beneath all that ice, a 12-year-old boy had always loved a girl with gray eyes. On the 4th morning, Elara opened her eyes. The fever was gone. She was pale and weak as a newborn lamb, but her gaze was clear. She saw Cassian slumped in the chair, his hair disheveled, his cravat gone, dark shadows carved under his eyes. He was holding her hand as if it were a lifeline. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice a rasp. He jolted awake. His eyes, red-rimmed and desperate, met hers. "Ella." She blinked at the name. "You called me." "I remember," he said, the words cracking. "I remember the lake, the boat, the forget-me-not. I remember everything. I found the letter from my aunt. I found your painting." He lifted the miniature from the table with trembling fingers. "You were 8 years old and you told her you were keeping a promise. I am so sorry. I am so desperately sorry." Alara stared at the tiny portrait, then at his ravaged face. A tear slipped down her cheek, then another. "You remembered," she breathed. "I remembered too late," he said, his voice breaking. "I loved you too late, but I have loved you since that summer, I swear it. I just forgot how." She reached up with a shaking hand and touched his cheek. He caught her fingers and pressed them to his lips, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The Duke, the cold marble statue, was weeping at her bedside. "I have been so alone," she whispered. "I know," he said. "I know, and I am the one who made you so, but I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel alone again." The weeks that followed were slow and tender. Alara recovered her strength gradually, and Cashin was at her side for every step. He brought her books and read to her by the fire. He carried her to the window seat so she could watch the first snow fall over the gardens. He learned how she took her tea, the way she smiled at the first sip, the stories behind the small scars on her hands from childhood tumbles. He gave her a new locket on the day she was well enough to walk in the gardens again. It was silver, with a tiny engraving of a willow tree and a lake. Inside was a fresh forget-me-not, pressed alongside the miniature of her as a child. "I want to make you a new promise," he said, standing with her under the bare winter branches. "I, Cashin Thornwood, do solemnly swear that I will never forget you again. I will remember every smile, every tear, every word. And I will love you, Alara, for every day that remains to me." She looked up at him, the gray eyes he had finally learned to read. "Even if I call you Cass." He smiled, a real smile, the first she had ever truly seen, especially then. The snow began to fall softly around them. He drew her into his arms, and for the first time since she had arrived at Thornwood Hall as a stranger, Alara felt the steady, sure beat of his heart against her own. It was not the wild passion of poems. It was something deeper, a quiet, certain warmth that asked for nothing but gave everything. In the spring, they returned to Lake Sarin together. The willows were green again, and the water was just as clear as she remembered. They stood on the same bank where a boy and a girl had once launched a little boat. Cashin knelt down, not with the formality of a duke, but with the humility of a man who had nearly lost the greatest treasure of his life. He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I kept the first promise badly," he said, "but I am making it again. Will you let me love you, Ella? Will you let me be the man you deserved all along?" She knelt down beside him in the grass, heedless of her fine gown. "You are already that man, Cass. You just needed time to find him." They sat together by the lake as the sun dipped low, and the years of loneliness melted away like morning frost. He told her all the things he had never said, how her quiet strength had shamed him, how her laughter in the garden had undone him, how the thought of losing her had brought him to his knees. She listened, and she wept a little, but this time the tears were not sorrowful. They were the kind of tears that wash old wounds clean. When they returned to Thornwood Hall, the household noticed the change. The Duke no longer retreated into his study for hours. He walked the gardens with his Duchess, his hand often resting at the small of her back. He laughed, a sound so unfamiliar that the servants stopped and stared. And the Duchess, she bloomed. Her eyes lost their guarded sadness and shone with a light that made even the sternest portrait in the gallery seem softer. The tenants prospered under their combined care. Alara's projects flourished, and Cashin joined her in them, discovering a purpose beyond ledgers and duties. Together they rebuilt the village school and planted a new orchard. They sat with the elderly woman Alara had first visited, and Cashin held her hand when she passed peacefully some months later. He understood then what Alara had always known, that a title meant nothing without the heart behind it. On the first anniversary of her recovery, Cashin led Alara back to the conservatory where she had once refused Nathaniel Ashby. He had filled it with forget-me-nots, thousands of them, spilling from pots and climbing the glass walls. She gasped when she saw it, her hand flying to her mouth. "You remembered," she said again, and this time it was not a question but a gift. "I will remember every single day," he said, "and when I am old and my memory fades, I will ask you to remind me. I will ask you to tell me the story of a boy who forgot his vow and a girl who was brave enough to wait." She stepped into his embrace, the scent of flowers all around them. "It is my favorite story." Outside the glass walls, the sun set over Thornwood Hall. Inside, a duke and his duchess held each other, not as strangers bound by duty, but as two people who had crossed years of silence to find their way back to a promise made in childhood. The boy had finally come home, and the girl who had never stopped loving him was no longer waiting. She was home, too,